I'm Barry Shaw, Senior Associate at the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, and this is the view from Israel's investigation into International Criminal Court charges of war crimes against Israel brought to them by the claims made by the terror-promoting PLO-led Palestinian Authority. Now, in this series, I'll interview Israelis and non-Israelis, people with professional military and legal expertise of conflict, the rules of war, and the behavior of our IDF soldiers, and comparing them to the obvious war crimes committed by Palestinian terror regimes in their field against both Israeli civilians and their own people. My guests will be experts in their field who have had or having direct impact on the current issue of the ICC pursuit of Israel. Now, when considering the best non-Israeli voice to invite onto the show, there was really only one person that ticked all the boxes, and that was Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British troops in various theatres of war. Welcome to the View from Israel, Richard.
Barry, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to join you today. We've met many times in the past, and I'm looking forward to being able to see you in the flesh as soon as we can in the future. Thank you for inviting me.
God willing, we'll have open borders or something again, or whether we see each other with green passports or whatever. I look forward to you being our guest over here in Israel once again. Now, tell my viewers some of your military background. Where did you do service and what capacity?
Thank you, Barry. I was a British Army infantry commander for about 30 years. And during my military career, I served extensively in Northern Ireland. I did about 8 tours over there, I think, of duty over the years, between 1979 and 2000. I also served in Iraq during the first Gulf War, and again after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. I've served in Afghanistan, where I commanded British forces for a period of just over 6 months, back in 2003 at the early stages of that campaign. And also I've commanded British troops fighting in the Balkans in a number of different capacities. And of course, on top of that, I've served in different places around the world where I've worked with a wide range of armed forces, including the American forces, the Israeli forces, the French forces, Germans, and numerous other armed forces around the world. So my experience is quite geographically extensive, and it runs from high intensity conflict, such as fighting in the first Gulf War, which was basically a major tank, infantry, artillery, and air battle, through to fighting on the streets of Belfast, which I think you could probably most closely associate that with the conflict in, for example, in Judea and Samaria, over where you are. Very different type of fighting, very different form of war, with an enemy that is much harder to identify and much harder to distinguish between those people who want to kill you and ordinary innocent civilians on the battlefield. And actually, I would say that the majority of my experience over that 30-year period includes that kind of fighting, whether it was in Afghanistan, the Balkans, Northern Ireland, or wherever else.
Now, tell me something about the dilemma of an army commander accustomed to fighting an army of uniformed soldiers in conventional warfare, suddenly thrown into an alien environment when everybody's a civilian. You can't differentiate between the innocent and the enemy until rockets are fired at your people and fire is rained down on your soldiers, weapons, roadside bombs, booby trap buildings, rockets appearing out of schools, houses and hospitals in territory that you don't control. I mean, where do you get the knowledge? Where do you get the training? Where do you get the experience on making the switch and learning how to combat that sort of enemy in a territory you don't really control, that's not yours?
I think they're really different types of activity, very, very different. Conventional warfare, high intensity conflict, like, for example, in the British Army's relatively recent experience, the First Gulf War, the Falklands War. These are conflicts where the enemy is easily identified, and as long as you can identify the enemy, you can attack and destroy him, or attempt to do so, and you can use all your military might. And in the case of the British Army, like the IDF, like the American Army, that tends to be overwhelming military might in most of the enemies we fought in recent years. And you can use that with little restraint. You don't have to, as long as you don't have to take account of civilian presence, then there's no restriction really on the extent to which you can administer violence against the enemy, unless they're surrendering, which is a different picture altogether. But when you're fighting a kind of insurgency type warfare, such as Northern Ireland, such as Afghanistan, and the conflicts that unfortunately you have in places like Gaza, it's really different, because the enemy deliberately blends into the civilian population. They don't wear a uniform on the whole. They can't easily be distinguished from civilians. 1 minute, for example, in Afghanistan, somebody can be firing at you with an AK-47 or pressing a button on an improvised explosive device. The next minute, they're tilling their field, and you don't even know that it's the same person. In many cases, they're very practiced at that. They use, most of the enemies that we fight and the Israelis fight, they use protected buildings. They use churches, mosques, synagogues, even where appropriate, hospitals, schools. They will use any protected buildings that they can, that they know you're going to be reluctant to attack. They will use them either to store weapons or to attack you from. They will deliberately use human shields, placing civilians in front of you, or using civilians to attack you. For example, in Afghanistan, it was not uncommon, for example, for the Taliban to have 14-year-old boys throwing grenades at soldiers. And if the soldier recognized the grenade thrower, he would hesitate before firing at a child. That's just human nature. Now, the Taliban knew that, which is why they use people like that to do it. It's the same with female suicide bombers. They will use any ruse they can to try and put you at a disadvantage. And a lot of people say that organizations like the Taliban, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda don't take any notice of the laws of war. Well, that's not true. They pay very close attention to the laws of war. And they don't actually observe them themselves, of course. But what they do is they learn them and they know them, so they know how restrained you are and they can use them against you. Those are some of the issues. And of course, in a conflict like Gaza, and to some extent in other conflicts that I've been involved in personally, the enemy we're fighting know they can't defeat us militarily. They know they can't do that. They can't, man to man, they can't fight you. They can't destroy you, because you generally have overwhelming force, including air power, which they generally speaking lack. So what they try and do, the tactics they try and use, are to lure you into killing their own civilian population. That's a deliberate intent. When they use human shields, it's not so much to screen their forces from us attacking them. It's more to do with trying to get us to attack them, so that they can then use that against us in the media. And that particularly applies, I think, to Israel. Not only to Israel, but it does apply strongly to Israel, where their objective, knowing they can't defeat the IDF militarily, their objective is to isolate Israel, to vilify Israel, to demonize Israel in the media, and generate propaganda against Israel, which can be used towards their ultimate goal of destroying Israel, politically rather than militarily. So those are some of the challenges that you face. And as a commander, it is extremely tough. And as a soldier, it's extremely tough. The last thing anyone wants to do in any Western democratic army, whether it's the IDF, the British Army, the Americans, is to kill innocent civilians. Now, we may be portrayed in a different way. We may be described as child killers and baby killers, but that's not what we want to do at all. It's the last thing we want to do. And of course, the risk of doing that weighs very heavily on the mind of any commander. And a commander has to take account of a range of things. One is he does not want to deliberately kill or wound innocent people. Of course not. Secondly, he does not want to breach the laws of armed conflict in their own right. because of course that lays him or her open to criminal prosecution, as well as the moral hazard that you face yourself. And thirdly, the commander has to do everything he can to defeat his enemy. So you've got those challenges, but you've still got to try and overcome those different challenges while defeating the enemy. Because if you don't manage to defeat and neutralize the enemy, then you're obviously not doing the job that you were sent there to do by your country. And there's one other thing that I think I ought to draw attention to, which often isn't thought about, and that's our own soldiers. Now, it's really important for any commander that he tries to destroy the enemy while preventing the deaths of innocent civilians. But at the same time, he's got to prevent the deaths of his own soldiers if he can. Yes, of course, some soldiers will die in combat. And, it's not what they're there for. They're there to kill the enemy. But sometimes it will happen, and it's an inevitability. But of course, you have to do your best not to have them killed, because if they're dead or wounded, they're no use to you to fight. They can't work towards your objective. And secondly, if you become a commander that is known to happily throw away his own soldiers' lives, then you're not going to be followed into battle and you become less effective. And then, of course, there's the moral issue of your duty of care for your own soldiers. So those things, and that does become a big question sometimes when, for example, in Afghanistan, in Gaza, wherever, you're trying to avoid killing innocent civilians. You're taking risks with your soldiers' lives at the same time. And in our army and in the Israeli army and other armies, many soldiers have given their lives to save the lives of innocent civilians. But it's a difficult balance, and for a commander, these are not easy decisions to take. You learn about this in the British Army. We have quite extensive training about rules of engagement, the laws of war, how you identify an enemy from an innocent civilian. You learn about their tactics. You learn about the geography of the area. You rely heavily on intelligence to tell you who is what, where. Intelligence gained either from human sources on the ground or from such as signals intelligence, air reconnaissance, satellite intelligence. And of course, exactly the same principles apply in Israel to the IDF when they're fighting. I was commander at one time of the training center that was responsible for training all British soldiers to fight in this kind of conflict. And it is quite a demanding thing. And they go through very extensive, detailed training, both to make them effective, but also with a heavy emphasis on trying to avoid killing innocent civilians.
I don't know, Richard, if you had ever had the spectre of terror attack tunnels out of which heavily armed terrorists suddenly appear in your local communities in order to kill and capture your soldiers or civilians and drag them back into their side of the battlefield, their territory. And then have your soldiers then being accused of being war criminals when you go into that territory in order to pursue the terrorists and block the terror tunnels.
Yeah, I mean, that's, one thing. I'm aware of a number of incidents in Gaza where exactly what you described happened. And I was on the ground in the vicinity of Gaza during some of these events. So I've got firsthand experience as an observer of what was happening, but also similar experience ourselves. And in the British forces, particularly in Afghanistan, well, equally everywhere really, but Afghanistan seemed to be a greater threat perhaps of this than other places. The British forces deliberately designed their tactics with one almost overriding principle, not totally overriding, one very important principle, which was to avoid allowing soldiers to be separated from their comrades, because we knew only too well that if a soldier becomes separated and is captured, then that soldier is likely to be tortured and killed. And not only the death of a soldier is something that one wants to avoid if one can, but also the effect on morale. And the same applies, of course, to the country's morale. And I know it's particularly keenly felt in Israel if an Israeli soldier is captured by Hamas terrorists or other terrorists, because everything is so immediate and close. And everybody in Israel has relatives who are serving or have served, and they probably served themselves as well. It's not quite the same closeness in Britain, But it nevertheless is important that that national morale is not affected by not only killing of soldiers, but also the capture and torture of soldiers. So it's a really, really important thing. And in some circumstances, you do have to use extreme force within the laws of armed conflict, but nevertheless extreme force to do your best to recover those individuals that are, if there are unfortunately any individuals captured, because it is such a very significant factor. And yes, of course, once you start doing that, once you you effectively let all hell break loose within the laws of war. I stress that all the time because I think it's something we observe, and your army most certainly observe it as well. You get accusations of war crimes, and it's very easy to accuse soldiers of committing war crimes. Some soldiers do kill civilians. Sometimes, unfortunately, they do. Sometimes they have no choice but to kill civilians in order to achieve their military objective, and that is not in itself illegal. It can be, but it isn't by definition illegal. But nevertheless, if you do that, then you're accused of war crimes by people who don't really understand what war crimes are. And equally, there are mistakes made in battle. Everyone in their day-to-day life makes many mistakes. I've made mistakes today already. Other people have as well. I'm sure many people watching this will have made mistakes today. But while we're making these mistakes, no one is trying to kill us, hopefully. For a soldier in battle, he's got to make split-second decisions sometimes when he's tired, wet, hungry, cold, frightened, and people are trying to kill him, and they're trying to kill his friends beside him. So you can imagine that will increase the likelihood of making a mistake, and mistakes do happen. Technology fails, communications fail, all sorts of errors occur, missiles go where they shouldn't go, and so on. That, again, is not war crimes. These are mistakes. And sometimes, of course, you also get bad soldiers who do bad things deliberately, like every other part of society. You have bad people. Thankfully, I think it's true to say that there are very few of those in either of our armies, but there are, of course, some. And so, and again, that is a matter of individual accountability. But all of these different situations occur and often result in our forces and Israeli forces frequently being accused of war crimes, totally unjustly. Yes, of course, sometimes war crimes are committed, and when they are, both of our countries again have highly recognized and respected legal systems, which will, when they possibly can, which will bring those individuals to justice.
Richard, I read an article of yours from a few years ago. It's called Britain, Lawfare and the ICC. Tell me what prompted you to write that, and what were the contents of that article of yours?
Well, like Israel, the UK and the US have come under attack from the International Criminal Court. And in my view, in the case of all three of those countries, quite wrongly. But let's speak about Britain first of all. Britain has been investigated by the International Criminal Court over allegations of war crimes, including rape, torture, murder in Afghanistan. That investigation ran on for a number of years and was started and stopped again and started again. And it ran on for many years with the threat of prosecution against British soldiers and possibly politicians and civil servants in The Hague, in the ICC's court. Thankfully, that investigation has ended for the moment. Doesn't mean to say it won't restart, but it's ended for the moment. The problem with it is that in my opinion, it was a politically motivated investigation, very much like the investigations into Iraq, into the US and Israel. And one of the reasons it was motivated was not the only reason, but one of the reasons is because the ICC has come under severe criticism for focusing too much on African countries committing war crimes. And some African countries threatened to withdraw from the ICC because of that. And so the ICC felt the need to put the spotlight elsewhere, to effectively to virtue signal that they were not just looking at African countries and other dictatorships, effectively. And so they put the spotlight on the UK and on Israel and Britain. And it's the reason those three were picked, apart from anything, there are plenty of reasons for it. It's very complicated, but one of the reasons those three countries were picked is because they're the only Western countries, really. You could argue France as well, but they're only really Western democracies that are actually using their armed forces to defend themselves in battle. And so they're the natural targets. And that's what we saw. And why should they not? Why should Western democracies not be subjected to investigation by the ICC? And by Western democracies, I also include Israel. Why shouldn't they? And the reason they shouldn't is because that's not what the ICC exists for. The ICC exists solely to bring to justice those people who are guilty of the most grievous crimes, where their own country is either incapable or unwilling to bring them to justice. Now, that does apply to many African countries, not everyone, but it does apply to many. It applies to other countries in the world. It does not apply to Britain, Israel, or the United States. They all have highly respected justice systems. Each of them has a track record of bringing to justice people who are accused of war crimes following an investigation. And so I think that this was my problem, that it was an illegitimate investigation into Britain. And not only that, but it also prompted British authorities to carry out the most extensive, detailed investigations into allegations, mostly spurious allegations, obviously spurious allegations at the time, of war crimes against British soldiers, which resulted over more than a decade in thousands of soldiers being investigated, some dragged into the dock, others just subjected to lengthy investigations, with marriages ruined, families destroyed, suicide attempts as a result of all this pressure being brought upon them. All in order to protect Great Britain from the political humiliation of soldiers being dragged into The Hague. In other words, in order to try and persuade the ICC to stop their investigation. Now, that to me is a real danger because, as I said, the vast majority of the accusations and the investigations were spurious and unfounded and should never have taken place. And it was a representation, I think, of the British government's weakness in allowing that to happen. Well, fortunately, Britain is now introducing legislation which should, I hope, but I'm not sure, prevent further iterations of that kind of, but what amounts to betrayal of the armed forces.
Well, there's another point to that, Richard, in that, for instance, in our case over here, just a few days ago, the Israeli government made a decision after a large powered meeting not to cooperate with the ICC. And the Israeli Attorney General, Mandelblit, one of the conditions that he laid down for this is that the ICC have no jurisdiction over Israel. 2 reasons. One, that Israel is not a member of the ICC, but another one, actually complying with some of the rules of the ICC, that even a non-member country, if they are carrying out their own, in our case, our own investigation of war crimes or any deviant behavior of any soldiers that have been reported, in other words, doing our own investigation, then the ICC have no authority to come and investigate. So as you were saying, if in Afghanistan you were carrying out your own investigation, then the ICC has no jurisdiction to investigate.
I think the Israeli case is even more grievous than the UK and US case. And by the way, the case against the US is still ongoing and it relates to Iraq and could also drag UK forces into that investigation, into further accusations. So we're still vulnerable in relation to Iraq to legal assault. But the Israeli situation is even more grievous for the reasons that you mentioned. In other words, that Israel is not a member of the International Criminal Court. It didn't sign up to the Rome Statute that founded the International Criminal Court for very good reason, because they knew, as we knew, but failed to take the appropriate action, that they would be very strong political targets for what is effectively has become a political court. But there are also other factors involved in this, and one of which is that the Palestinian Authority is the entity that has brought these charges to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court, against Israelis. It's the Palestinian Authority that has delegated its jurisdiction over Israeli soldiers to the ICC, which is impossible. It's legally impossible because under the Oslo agreements, the Fatah and Palestinian Authority, which was created by the Oslo agreements, formally and solemnly accepted under that treaty that they had no legal jurisdiction over any Israelis on any territory that they controlled. So they didn't have the jurisdiction, so they can't delegate it to the ICC. Yet the ICC ignored that. And that was recognized. Those problems with jurisdiction over Israel were recognized by the president of the International Criminal Court pre-trial chamber, who quite strongly made a statement saying that what has been decided by the ICC was illegal and did not conform to international law, but was overruled by the other two judges. And also, interestingly, I think a number of other countries, I forget the number exactly, but something like 8 other countries who are member states of the International Criminal Court, member states, formally objected to the decision to prosecute Israel. That includes Germany, Australia, and some other countries, and the US, of course, although they're not members of the ICC themselves. But ICC members did object, which is unprecedented, and it just shows that the breach in the ICC's authority that has occurred here, and it results in the ICC, in my view, being a political court, a politicized court, which it doesn't just risk injustice to Israel and also feed the propaganda surrounding this entire situation, which will result in deaths. Propaganda will motivate people. They will believe Israel has committed war crimes. They'll believe Israel is rightly in front of the ICC, and it will motivate violence. But not only that, it also undermines the credibility of the ICC. The ICC is a very important organization. It should be anyway, because there are many countries where people commit war crimes and they're not brought to justice. And if there is no international body, the successor effectively to the Nuremberg tribunals, which is what the ICC is, then where is the deterrent against that continuing? And unfortunately, by the ICC taking these actions, particularly against Israel, but also against Britain and the US, they undermine their own status and their own position as a court.
Yeah, Richard, one of the hypocritical aspects of the ICC and even the Palestinian authorities' participation in this farce about Israel and war crimes is that the ICC looks on the Palestinian Authority as a state. But according to all definitions of what constitutes a state, the Palestinian Authority civil administration in Ramallah doesn't constitute a state. But even if it did, then if they represent the Palestinians, do they also represent Hamas in Gaza? Is that part of the state of Palestine? In which case, why haven't the International Criminal Court, looking at Palestine as a member, really gone after one of their members for very clear and blatant human rights crime? Let's just name, for instance, one of many, Hamas, in their actions not only against Israel, but doing it, as we've said in this talk, about using their own people as human shields, operating out of the civil society over there, using their people as human shields to fire rockets into Israeli civilian centers. That in itself is a war crime. So how come terrorists, perpetrators of war crimes, make an application to the International Criminal Court against a democratic country like Israel?
Of course, you raise an absolutely accurate point, Barry, there. And the reality is that it's another reason why the International Criminal Court is undermining its own credibility, because it is affording a platform against international law for a non-state, because the Palestinian Authority is not a recognized state under the terms of the Rome Statute. It is not a recognized state, yet it has been given recognition as a state unilaterally by the ICC, interfering in international politics. And not only that, but as you rightly point out, the International Criminal Court, the Palestinian Authority, it does, of course, include Gaza, theoretically. its territory that it controls does include Gaza, and indeed the ICC, part of their investigation is into events in Gaza. And it includes Hamas, and Hamas is a proscribed terrorist organization. And not only that, but, which perhaps fewer people recognize, I'm sure most of your viewers in Israel will recognize it, but the Palestinian Authority themselves, Fatah, they are also guilty of perpetrating war crimes, of funding terrorism, encouraging terrorism through numerous means. And yet they're the people that are being allowed to bring these charges against the legitimate armed forces of a Western democracy. Now, I've given evidence myself at a number of UN Human Rights Council sessions, not including, but exclusive to the 3 separate Gaza conflicts, starting off with Operation Pillar of Defense. I've testified in front of those 3 investigations and at their emergency sessions. And the distortions that they bring to the situation are almost breathtaking, because they're not they sometimes pay lip service to an investigation and very loose allegations of possible war crimes by Hamas terrorists or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But it's very much lip service. This is not the purpose. Their purpose is to get Israel, to nail Israel. And it's unjust, it's unfair, and it should be repudiated by every single member of the UN Human Rights Council, as the ICC's investigation should be repudiated by every member of the International Criminal Court. And of course, the ICC is, in this case, is effectively an extension of the UN Human Rights Council. The UN Human Rights Council have been working very hard, and the activists within it have been working very hard to get Israel in front of the ICC. And a number of their previous reports and investigations have been designed deliberately to do that. And now they've achieved it. Let's hope the new chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, who's a British citizen, let us hope he has a rethink and withdraws the allegations against Israel and ceases to investigate. I'm not confident he will, but he should do. And in the meantime, I believe that the decision you mentioned that Israel has taken not to cooperate with the ICC is absolutely the correct one, because there's no way that any justice is going to come for Israel out of the International Criminal Court.
Richard, I'm not confident that the next special prosecutor is any going to be more favorably endowed towards Israel. But going back to the point I made about the hypocrisy of the ICC, and particularly the Palestinians, goes another step further. If the Palestinian Authority, considered a state, is a member of the ICC and is seriously concerned for the safety and well-being of its own people, then why didn't the Palestinian Authority also bring war crimes charges against Assad and the Syrian army for simple recognition that a blatant war crime has been taking place regularly in Syria, by Syria using chemical weapons on its own people and even barrel bombing its own civilians? One of 2 of those attacks were on the Palestinians, in which an estimated 3,000 Palestinians in the refugee camp, the Yarmouk refugee camps, were slaughtered by Assad. But the Palestinian Authority, a member of the ICC, didn't bring any charges against Syria or the Assad for the war crimes against their own people.
The reality is, of course, that all of these actions, the Palestinian Authority and the International Criminal Court, in my view, is not carrying this action out in order to see justice. It isn't justice they want. What they want is to attack Israel. This is part of a long-term anti-Israel propaganda campaign. That's what, the Palestinian Authority don't care a damn about Palestinians being abused either by their own people or by Hamas in Gaza or by people in any other country. They only care that they can bring some kind of spurious allegations against Israel on the pretext of war crimes. So it's not, we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that there's any element of justice being brought into play here. It's all about political warfare against Israel. And it is absolutely abhorrent and shameful, and every reputable, right-thinking member of the International Criminal Court and the UN Human Rights Council should be standing up against it, and they should be ashamed of themselves for not doing so.
Richard, I also claim that there is a symbiotic relationship between the International Criminal Court and certain United Nations committees and bodies. One of those is the human rights relationship. And what I see here is, quite frankly, an extension of something that you were personally and professionally involved in when you gave evidence at the United Nations after they opened up an investigation of war crimes against Israel, led by Richard Goldstone into claims of war and human rights crimes allegedly committed by the IDF. And that was going back to 2014 during Operation Cast Lead. Do you see the connection there? Talk to us about how you view what evidence you gave to the United Nations at that time. And do you see this ongoing campaign anti-Israel carrying on now 7 years later?
Yeah, I mean, Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, and all of the other operations that have taken place in and around Gaza, including over the last 2 or 3 years, the so-called Great March of Return, the border violence between Gaza, on the Gaza border with Israel. All of this is a part of a continuing campaign in which the ICC is a part. Now, in some cases, they may have been witting, but they certainly are aware of the reality of what they're taking part in. And the UN Human Rights Council the same. And the UN Human Rights Council gave credence to these allegations by their reports into all of the conflicts that have taken place in Gaza. The first one, which I think was in 2008, you mentioned, Operation Cast Lead, the investigation chaired by Judge Goldstone. I've been involved in all of the investigations into these conflicts, but that was the first one I was involved with. And I could see, as a military professional who had been fighting this kind of conflict over many years, for most of my life, I could see immediately that the allegations being made against Israel were false, and blatantly false, not just false, but actually diametrically opposed to the truth and the reality. And Israel was accused, the IDF was accused of deliberately killing innocent civilians, of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity.
كيف حالك؟ أهلا، قل لي مش المستشفى الوفاة، يعني مأكد فيش حدا غاد من المرضى؟ طب بمستشفى الوفاة احنا عم نحكي عن السجاير. عشان نكون متأكدين إنه فيش غاد مرضى فيش إشي يعني. لا في إشي بس فيش مرضى في أجهزة ومعدات. بس ما في مرضى غاد. مرضى ما فيش، منازلين ما فيش. كيف الحال؟ حكيت الحمد لله، حكيت أنا كمان مرة بحكي لك. مدير المستشفى رد عليك مدير المستشفى؟ حكيت معاه، حكى لي إنه بالنسبة له ما في أي طواقم طبية موجودة ولا مرضى، هو سكر المستشفى وسكر كل أبواب المستشفى وما فيش مجال لأي حدا يدخل من المستشفى لأنها مغلقة. بس أنت حكيت يعني مع السيد قال لك فيش حدا منهم غاد. فيش حدا منهم غاد. لأنه إحنا بهمنا نوضح كمان يعني إذا بيكون في يعني عندنا لقواتنا من غاد استهداف، بيكون في نشطاء اللي هن يعني لسه موجودين بقلب المستشفى وبيسووا لنا استهداف، يعني بتعرف انت حسب يعني عندنا يعني كمان قانون الدولي اللي هو بيسمح لنا كمان احنا انه احنا بدنا نحافظ يعني احنا غادي نحافظ على جنودنا وبدنا نحافظ كمان على يعني بتعرف المواطنين دولة اسرائيل ما يكونش اطلاق نار من غاد، ما يكونش كمان من غاد اطلاق صواريخ. طيب ماشي الحال، هذا الكلام بوضح لي
And from my own knowledge and experience, I know and knew that wasn't the case. And I told the International Criminal Court, the UN Human Rights Council, I told them that at the time. And my testimony to them included the fact that from my knowledge and experience, the Israel Defense Force actually carried out greater and more strenuous efforts to prevent the loss of innocent life on the battlefield than any other army had done in history. And that was the case back in Operation Cast Lead in 2008. It's been the case in every conflict ever since, and even more so, because as these conflicts have progressed, the IDF is an organization that learns a great deal from its own experience, and it's improved the way it's been able to save the lives of innocent civilians. And I was there in the latest conflict that I was present for, which was the Great March of Return, a couple of years ago now. There was the time when I was there. I was on the border with Gaza. I was right there with the snipers, with the observers, with the commanders. I wasn't back where the press were watching it from afar. I was watching it from close up. And I could see with my own eyes and hear and learn about the actions that the IDF were taking and had taken to try and prevent this incursion into its territory, which was extremely dangerous, to try and prevent that happening while minimizing the loss of lives of innocent civilians and also protecting their own soldiers and their own civilians. And so the allegations and the accusations made over that conflict and also the previous conflicts were just, to my mind, blatantly false. And the UN Human Rights Council never had a credible military advisor working with them. They didn't have anybody who understood war, had taken part in war, and who was in a position to be able to bring insight into what they were actually seeing and reading about, who could have brought some reality to it. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is because they didn't want it. They didn't want objectivity. They didn't want expertise. They had a foregone, each of their reports were written with a foregone conclusion that Israel was guilty, and actually filling in the spaces was just a formality. And they didn't want it interfered with by people who might raise questions over this agenda that Israel was carrying out war crimes.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Richard, because that, in fact, is one of the other claims that have been made against Israel. In other words, the impression from over here is they took a scattershot attempt, throwing out bullets in various directions, hoping that one of them would stick. You know, you have, for instance, the fact that if Jewish people built a home in Judea, Samaria, or Jerusalem, that's a war crime. But the other one is, as you said, is the manufactured rioting and protest and violence on the border, which was in which Hamas paid teenagers and women and other people to make up the masses, of which their own terrorists can be immersed in the crowds and march and storm their way towards the barrier, the border, and then cut out the clippers and the wires to breach the border. And they were concealing weapons and everything. This itself was one of the instruments that the International Criminal Court brought in to try and show, again, war crimes by Israeli soldiers. So I was very glad that you were there to witness this and potentially give evidence if it should come to this, which I hope it doesn't. But just concluding, you wrote a recent article which is called "Can We Win in the Grey Zone?" Richard, I'd really like to interview this. This is a standalone article, and you have a very precise opinion of where we are in warfare. My question to you for this segment, for this issue, is if we're talking about Israel's battle against terrorism, whether it's coming from the West Bank or under the control of the Palestinian Authority, or from Hamas in Gaza, where they're firing rockets and it looks more like a military campaign, is that what you would call a grey zone, or is this a conventional war, a battlefield, if you like? How do you define a grey zone?
This rocket which was shot right while I was live on France 24 on the English network. This 80% of Gaza.
Okay, you all right?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
What
happened?
Camera.
What happened?
Yeah, fine. This was a rocket. This was a rocket. Rockets were just shot right next to where we're standing. This is just some 50 meters away from the hotel where most of the international media is stationed. This right here is a launching pad for rockets used by Palestinian militants. Now, this type of setup is at the heart of the debate within the international community, but also between Israel and the Palestinian militants. The Israeli army has repeatedly accused Palestinian militants of shooting from within densely populated civilian areas, and that is precisely the type of setup we have right here. Rockets set up right next to buildings with a lot of residents in them, who, by the way, have not fled around here. Now, the other very noticeable element to be taken into consideration is about 100 meters behind me, a blue UN flag floating above this building. This is another accusation which has been made by the Israeli government and Israeli forces. This rocket launching site is right next to a UN facility.
The grey zone, as it's become known, is effectively the area between normal international discourse between nations, between peoples, and normal international competitiveness, normally economic, diplomatic, etc., and warfare. So it's sort of short of warfare, and it's it can't be seen as being just normal activity. It's generally aggressive. It can include diplomatic action. It can include cyber attack. It can include economic action. It can include military action, as well as things like disinformation, espionage, and so on. So it's a kind of, as the name suggests, it's a sort of blurred area that perhaps is not that easily understood. I would give one example of a grey zone, a prominent piece of grey zone activity, which is the US attack against Qasim Soleimani, the leader of the IRGC Quds force, who was killed in a rocket attack. That was a grey zone attack by the US in response to vast amounts of grey zone activity led by Soleimani and others in Iran. So it was never going to result in an all-out conflict. That attack wasn't going to. It was calibrated by the Americans to make sure it didn't. And much of the Iranian activity against the US, including rocket attacks in Iraq, and against Israel, including cyber attacks on their water facilities, including attempts to attack and disable Israeli shipping, etc., and various other forms of attack. That's all grey zone activity. It's not going to result in high intensity battle. I think when you look at the Gaza conflict, that's a different story. There is a lot of grey zone activity taking place there. There's a lot of attacks. I would say, an attack that a rocket attack, firing a rocket out of Gaza towards Sderot, say, a single or two or three rockets is not warfare. It's not going to prompt a really significant combat response from Israel, and they know that. That's why they do these things. They want to keep up the pressure. They want to impress their paymasters in Tehran, but they don't want to inflict war. But sometimes it explodes beyond that, and deliberately so. Sometimes massive numbers of rocket attacks, attack tunnels, etc., can lead to war. And so I would say operations like Cast-Lead, Pillar of Defense, other operations in Gaza are not grey zone activities. These are warfare. It's when the grey zone ceases to be. But it is an interesting area, and I would say the article you mentioned, I kind of question whether Western democracies are up to fighting in the grey zone militarily. And I make the exclusion of Israel because I know Israel is, because Israel has been fighting effectively in the grey zone for many years, carrying out, whether it's targeted killings against terrorists who are threatening them, whether it's other forms of cyber activity, action against the Iranian nuclear program, all of that, even events like seizing the Iranian nuclear archive, those are grey zone activities. They're not going to result in war. But if Israel got to the stage where, the Israeli government felt that they were directly threatened by an Iranian nuclear capability, then we would probably leave the grey zone and move on to extensive high intensity military strikes against Iran. In other words, out of the grey zone. But it's a fascinating subject that I'll be very happy to speak to again in the future. Before I conclude, I'd like to make one other remark, which I think is something that always does concern me when we're talking about these issues. And that is that the organizations like the International Criminal Court and the United Nations Human Rights Council, the people they damage the most, and the same goes for the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and all of the other people involved in this war against Israel, the people they damage the most are not Israelis. They're not Israelis. The Israelis will prevail. The Israelis will survive. The Israelis go from strength to strength. We've seen it even during the coronavirus pandemic. We've seen the strength, the prevalence of Israel, and that will continue. So Israel is not under threat from it. Yes, of course, it's problematic for Israel. Particularly, it's problematic for people that live in towns like Sderot and other places, and in Gush Etzion, where they're potentially under attack on a fairly frequent basis. Of course, it's a real problem for them, but not for the country as a whole. The people who suffer most from this situation, caused to a large extent by the ICC and UNH and Human Rights Council, are the Palestinian Arabs. They live a miserable life in many cases. They live a life of poverty, a lack of opportunity. They suffer a great deal, and they do so not because of Israel, but because of their own leaders who are encouraged to maintain this horrific existence for their people by the UN Human Rights Council and the ICC. And it's those people, I believe, those ordinary Palestinian Arab civilians, that we should feel most concerned about. And I think I feel even more than trying to fight against this propaganda, political warfare campaign epitomized by the ICC and the UN Human Rights Council, as well as Hamas, PIJ, etc. I feel even more motivated to fight this battle because of the plight of the Palestinian people, who are the worst sufferers. Of course, we don't want to see these attacks taking place against Israel, but Israel can withstand it. The Palestinian Arab people cannot withstand it, and they're being betrayed and let down by these international bodies.
Very strong words, very wise words from Richard. Golda Meir once said that peace will only come with the Palestinians once the Palestinian mothers learn to love their children more than they hate us. I think what the Palestinians have to do, and it's been clear for so long, is they have to take more radical steps in order to change and choose their leadership, which will put them on the road for pragmatism, peace and prosperity. Richard, thank you very much for contributing to this. I look forward to talking to you again, because I've got lots of questions with regard to the grey zone issues. I look forward to speaking to you again, but thank you for this contribution, valuable contribution with regard to Israel's battle against the International Criminal Court.
Thank you, Barry. A great pleasure, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much.